Many modern-day historians tell us that our nation's founding fathers were a diverse group of atheists, deists, and political revolutionaries. So where did they find the common ground and the inspiration for the ideas that birthed the most successful nation in history? Did their faith play a role in our nation's founding ideas? Do we have, as many historians claim, a godless constitution? Discover the forgotten and astonishing story of our nation's foundation in the American Heritage series. For centuries, Americans were taught a truthful view of history that recognized the godly heroes and moral foundation our nation was founded upon. But in recent years, a new version of history has assaulted the moral and spiritual fiber of our nation, leaving the truth of our past eliminated and forgotten until today. Join historian David Barton and experience the untold story of our nation's history in the American Heritage series. In the classrooms and civil arenas of our nation today, you will find little evidence of the moral and Christian principles America was founded upon. Did our founding fathers intend for us to live in a secular society? Or did the founding fathers believe that Christian principles should be at the center of our government and constitution? And what did they have to say about the separation of church and state? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
The Constitution is a remarkable document. We in America live in the longest ongoing constitutional republic in the world. We've been blessed by that document, but we know so little about those who wrote the document.
Right.
If you ask people who wrote the Constitution, they'll say, James Madison, I think, had something to do with it, and maybe George Washington, and that's usually as far as it gets. Maybe they'll mention Ben Franklin. But we had 55 individuals who gave us that document that today we so appreciate. And there were specific contributions made by many of them, and we just no longer talk about them. We don't talk about folks like Gouverneur Morris. You know, Gouverneur Morris, when's the last time you've heard that name? Every time we go into a courtroom to argue about a constitutional principle, we're arguing about exactly what he did.
Wow.
Gouverneur Morris was a signer from Pennsylvania. He was the final signer to sign the document. He was the most active member at the Constitutional Convention. He spoke on the floor of the convention 173 times. That's more than anybody else. Now, what makes him really remarkable is he is the penman of the Constitution. So we have these little kind of things hanging in our schools, constitutions. You're just looking at the handiwork of Gouverneur Morris.
Wow.
He's a prolific writer. As a matter of fact, when France was doing their constitution, he said, we've already done ours in America, let us show you how to do a constitution. And in doing that writing for the French Constitution, he told them that above all, they had to make sure that education was teaching religion and the duties of man toward God. He said, we already do that in America, you guys need to do that in France. Now, we don't hear that today. We hear, oh no, well, Constitution, you can't have any kind of religion in schools. Time out. The man who wrote the Constitution, the penman of the Constitution, says the schools should be teaching religion. Schools should be teaching morality based on religion. I mean, that's in his writings. But we know so little about the signers of the Constitution, so how do we really know? We just base it because somebody else told us? That's the fortunate side of history, is we have prolific writings. These steps lead up to the Visitors Gallery for the House of Representatives. Over the landing, you see a huge painting of the signing of the Constitution on September the 17th, 1787. This picture measures 20 feet by 30 feet. 55 founding fathers served at the convention which produced the Constitution, and 39 of them eventually signed that document. And like the painting of the signers of the Declaration, many of these faces and names are unfamiliar to us today. Let's rediscover something about many of those in this picture. Let's begin with Abraham Baldwin. Not only was he the chief founder of the University of Georgia, but in his time he was considered to be one of America's youngest theologians. At the age of 21, he was offered a professorship of divinity at Yale University, and throughout the American Revolution he served as a military chaplain. Abraham Baldwin, a signer of the Constitution, was not only a Christian, but he was a minister of the gospel. This man seated at the right of the table is Roger Sherman. He holds a unique position among the Founding Fathers in that he was the only founder to sign all four of America's founding documents: the Articles of Association in 1774, the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the Articles of Confederation in 1781, and the U.S. Constitution in 1787. Also, during the Constitutional Convention, Roger Sherman was instrumental in resolving the conflict over representation between the big states and the small states. Sherman's solution, now enshrined in the Constitution, was that Congress should be made up of two bodies, a Senate, wherein each state, whether large or small, would have equal strength and an equal vote, good news for the small states, and a House, wherein each state's strength would be determined by its population, good news for the big states. After the Constitution was ratified, Sherman became a member of the first Congress where he helped frame the Bill of Rights. However, in addition to being a leading statesman, Roger Sherman was also a theologian. In fact, a creed he personally wrote was adopted by his church.
I believe that God did send his own Son to become man, die in the room and stead of sinners, and thus to lay a foundation for the offer of pardon and salvation to all mankind. That at the end of this world there will be a resurrection of the dead and a final judgment of all mankind, when the righteous shall be publicly acquitted by Christ the judge and admitted to everlasting life and glory, and the wicked be sentenced to everlasting punishment.
Roger Sherman, a distinguished founding father and a signer of the Constitution, was also a Christian theologian. In fact, his contributions to American government are so great that he is one of those who has been honored with a statue here at the Capitol, located in East Central Hall. When you look at the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention and those who wrote it, we so often get the tone today that that was a secular document. Those are secular guys. They didn't have any religious intent,
right,
which is really nonsense. When you look particularly after they came out of the Constitutional Convention, what they said about that document is really unbelievably religious. You have Benjamin Franklin, who at the close of the convention says, I'm not saying that the Constitution is divinely inspired. He says, but I am saying that something of this momentous, this impact to so many million people could not have come into existence without being guided and directed by that omnipotent and all-powerful being in whom we live and move and have our being. So Franklin says, I'm not saying it's divinely inspired, but I am telling you this is an act of God.
Wow.
Then you get James Madison, that when he did the Federalist Papers to explain what they'd done in the Constitution, he said to the pious man, it's impossible not to recognize in this document a finger of that almighty providence who was extended to us throughout the course of the Revolution. He said, and he concluded, he said, this document is a miracle. And that was the same term George Washington used. When he looked at the document at the end, he said, he said, you want my feelings? He wrote a letter. Someone asked him, what do you think about the Constitution? Because they want to know whether it's supported. He says, you want to know my feelings? I'm very candid about this. This document is a miracle of heaven.
Wow.
He thought that God had done it. And then as it came time to ratify, Dr. Benjamin Rush, who'd signed the Declaration, who lived in Philadelphia, who knew all these guys doing the Constitution, who was talking to them day by day, came time, they finished the Constitution, it's now time to ratify it. And Benjamin Rush is an evangelical Christian. He says, I'm not saying the Constitution is divinely inspired. He said, but I am saying that the Constitution is as much of a miracle as any miracle performed in the Old or the New Testament. And today we sit back and say, oh no, it was a secular document. Why, they wouldn't want religious activities in public.
Wow.
That's just not in the records.
In the classrooms and civil arenas of our nation today, you will find little evidence of the moral and Christian principles America was founded upon. Did our founding fathers intend for us to live in a secular society? Or did the founding fathers believe that Christian principles should be at the center of our government and Constitution? And what did they have to say about the separation of church and state? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
William Samuel Johnson. Not only did he sign the Constitution, but he was a leading educator of his day, becoming the first president of Columbia College. Interestingly, in an exercise which we still practice today, William Samuel Johnson was a speaker at a public graduation exercise.
Your first great duties, you are sensible, are those you owe to heaven, to your Creator and Redeemer. Let these be ever present in your minds and exemplified in your lives and conduct. Imprint deep upon your minds the principles of piety towards God and a reverence and a fear of His holy name. For the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, and its practice is everlasting happiness. reflect deeply and often upon your relations with God. Remember that it is in God you live and move and have your being. That, in the language of David, he is about your bed and about your path and spieth out all your ways. That there is not a thought in your hearts, nor a word upon your tongues, but lo, he knoweth them altogether, and that he will one day call you to a strict account for your conduct in this mortal life. Remember, too, that you are the redeemed of the Lord, that you are bought with a price, even the inestimable price of the precious blood of the Son of God. Finally, in the elegant and expressive language of St. Paul, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things, and do them, and the God of peace shall be with you.
This founding father and signer of the Constitution even delivered sermons from the Bible at public school graduations.
I feel the subject matter is really the founding fathers or the framers of the Constitution.
Yes.
Is there a difference between framers and founding fathers?
Some people try to make a very narrow category for framers or for founding fathers. But essentially, a founding father is someone who had a great deal of input on us becoming an independent nation and having the documents we have.
Right.
So those who did the Declaration of Independence, they're founding fathers, but they're also framers of the Declaration. Those who did the Constitution, 55, they're founding fathers, but they're framers of the Constitution. Those who did the Bill of Rights, there's 90 of them, they're founding fathers, but they're also framers of the Constitution. There's been a movement in contemporary America to say that there's only 5 or 6 or 7 founding fathers, 5 or 6 or 7 framers of the Constitution. That's just not accurate. Everyone who signed that, just because we don't know them today doesn't mean they're not significant.
Correct. Yeah.
See, this is a problem we have even with James Madison. James Madison in every textbook today is called the father of the American Constitution. Well, all right, that's kind of okay, but the problem was in the first 100 years after the Constitution was written, the father of the Constitution, there were 4. There was George Washington, there was Roger Sherman, there was Charles Cosworth Pinckney, and there was James Wilson. Now, we may know who Washington is today, but there's a reason that previous generations pointed to James Wilson, that they pointed to Charles Cosworth Pinckney, and they pointed to Roger Sherman and said, these are the fathers of the Constitution. Well, today we only use Madison, and we think he's the guy who wrote it. What we don't know is that Madison, a lot of what he proposed was largely rejected by the other delegates. You'll find in the records of the Constitutional Convention, Madison made 70 proposals. 40 of them got rejected by his friends at the convention. He came in with a Virginia plan. They early trashed that, said we're not going there. So we've made a man to be the most authoritative source on the Constitution that was more often than not rejected by the other founding fathers for his ideas. Why do we do that? Because he's the one founding father that in recent years we found writings that would make him appear to be anti-religious.
Wow.
He came out with writings and said, you know, all those religious things I did early on, I think that was all a mistake. I shouldn't have done it. Oh, you need to be the father of the Constitution. Now we can take you into the court and say, look what he said about religion. We shouldn't have it in public life. He's the father of the Constitution.
Basically, history is trying to rewrite out of our founding fathers.
How did that happen? Is it just because the
Well, it's because by and large we don't know our own history.
Yeah.
I mean, you ask
Ignorance.
an American, ignorance has done it to us. The Scripture says his people perish for lack of knowledge. It's the same thing with American history. The founding fathers in giving us the Constitution, when they had given us the Declaration, 4 of the clauses of the Declaration dealt with judicial abuses, judicial activism. So 11 years later, when they give us the Constitution, they have a chance to solve everything they complained about in the Declaration.
Right.
So in the Constitution, they turn around and give us 6 clauses in the Constitution to make sure we don't have judicial activism in America. Well, when's the last time anyone's read the Constitution? And we talk about it, we take an oath to uphold it.
Yeah.
I actually know a member of Congress right now who's introducing a bill to require every member of Congress to read the Constitution. He says, you know, we do take an oath to uphold it, but we never read it.
Yeah.
That's every American does that. We would not know, for example, that the Constitution says that federal judges do not hold lifetime appointments. Article 3, Section 1, Constitution says, we think they hold lifetime appointments. We think they're one of 3 co-equal branches. Constitution says they're not. We bought into all of this.
Yeah. It reminds me of the scripture, the truth you know sets you free.
That's right.
It's not the truth shall set you free, it's the truth you know.
That's right.
So we have...
We've gotten away. Let me give you a really good quote on history. Whoever controls the present controls the past.
Right.
Whoever controls the past controls the future. That's why what you write in textbooks is so important.
Yeah.
You see, if we write in textbooks, for example, that the Founding Fathers were all irreligious, and if we look back and only pick 2 or 3 out of the past, then that affects our future policies. We're going to say, oh no, they don't want this religious expression going in public. However, if right now we said, well, out of 55 at the Constitutional Convention, 52 of the 55 were members of Orthodox Christian churches, if that was the past we knew, then the future we have says, I don't think they're going to have any trouble with prayer in public events. Don't think they're going to have any trouble with God in a motto. Don't think they're going to have any trouble with God in a pledge. Because 52 of the 55 guys who did the Constitution were members of Orthodox Christian churches. But that's not what we get. We get the 2 or the 3, and so whoever controls the present and writes the textbooks about the past controls the future. And that's what's happened to all of us. The history we know is what we've been taught in textbooks rather than going back to documents that have it. Over here on the far right is Jacob Broom. Interestingly, all you can see of him in this picture is the top of his head. The reason for this is that he is one of the few Founding Fathers who never had a portrait made. We do know that he was part of the Constitutional Convention. We do know that he signed the Constitution. What we don't know is what he looked like. Therefore, the painting omits his face. One other thing that we do know about Jacob Broom is that he was a devout Christian and that he raised his children in the Christian faith. One evidence of this is seen in this letter, which he wrote to his son James in 1794. James had left home to attend college at Princeton, and Jacob, like a good father, was concerned about how his son would behave while away at school.
I flatter myself that you will be what I wish, but don't be so much flatterer as to relax of your application. Don't forget to be a Christian. I have said much to you on this head, and I hope an indelible impression is made.
Jacob Broom reminding his son to stay true to the Christian teachings in which he was raised. This letter is yet one more proof that our Founding Fathers were indeed men of religious conviction.
America was founded on biblical principle.
America was founded on biblical principles by men who imbibed those biblical principles, who expressed those biblical principles in their writings and their policies. The signers of the Constitution were overwhelmingly Christian, and they enacted biblical policies in what they did, both in that document, through that document, and subsequently to that document in the federal government.
In the classrooms and civil arenas of our nation today, you will find little evidence of the moral and Christian principles America was founded upon. Did our Founding Fathers intend for us to live in a secular society? Or did the Founding Fathers believe that Christian principles should be at the center of our government and Constitution? And what did they have to say about the separation of church and state? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
So it's accurate to say that roughly 95% of the framers of the Constitution, if you want to even be broader with the Founding Fathers of America, were all Christians and desired to have biblical truth inside and were getting their wisdom from the Bible.
That's exactly right. You will find that throughout their writings. Give you another example of a signer of a Constitution. James Wilson, considered early on in the early generations as one of the fathers of the Constitution. Now, who's heard of James Wilson today? He's in a really select group of framers, of Founding Fathers. Only 6 individuals signed both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. James Wilson was one of those 6. When George Washington became president, he appointed 6 justices to the U.S. Supreme Court, 1 Chief Justice, 5 Associate Justices. James Wilson was one of the first 6 justices appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. James Wilson, while he is sitting on the court, came up with the idea of, let's have law schools. Let's teach law to students. So James Wilson signed the Declaration, signed the Constitution. By the way, he was the second most active member at the Constitutional Convention. He spoke on the floor of the convention 168 times, so he's very active in framing the Constitution. Now he's on the U.S. Supreme Court as an original justice, and he decides to start law schools. This is the first legal textbook written for students. This is James Wilson's textbook that he did for students. Wow. Now, there's a 3-volume set that he did for students. In this volume right here, he tells students that you cannot have good civil law if it's not based on divine law.
Oh my gosh.
Wait a minute, I thought we had to take 10 Commandments out of the courtroom. No, he's telling us right up front, if your civil law contradicts divine law, your civil law is wrong.
Wow.
Now, that sounds to me like he might be using the Bible as the basis of public policy. See, and he's the second most active member of the convention. He's the original justice on the Supreme Court. We don't talk about him. See, what we get is a steady diet of folks who do not have that faith perspective, and we're told that's what they wanted. It's not that we don't have some irreligious founders. It's that what's happened in American history is we've decided to make the exception into the rule. We take the irreligious and make that look like it was predominant, and that's absolutely not the case, and their writings make that clear.
So the original founders were based upon the Bible and the principles of the Bible.
That's right. Go back, go online somewhere, go to a used bookstore, and start pulling out American history textbooks from before 1900. And you're going to read American history that will just pop your eyes out as you see how often they quote the scriptures. And we used to teach in our textbooks because we cited the writings, we cited the records, we knew who the 250 founding fathers were rather than just 5 or 6 that we've kind of picked and choose today. We knew who those guys were. So it's not a problem of we're creating new history by saying they were religious. No, we're just pointing back to their documents that used to be printed in the textbooks that no longer are. This is not a matter of lack of documentation to prove that the signers of the Constitution, a number of the signers of the Constitution literally were theologians. We have literal theologians who were signers of the Constitution, and you will find in the debates, not only after when they did the Constitution, but many of them went into Congress after they did the Constitution. They regularly cite the Bible in pointing back to constitutional clauses and in pointing to laws that they're enacting. I mean, these are federal laws. These are not just opinions of individuals here and there. These are what they did in laws, and this is what we used to know in America. Another of the signers who appears in this painting is James McHenry. James McHenry was a military officer, and he served throughout the American Revolution as aide to General George Washington. When Washington became president, he selected James McHenry as Secretary of War, and McHenry continued in that post also under President John Adams. The site for the writing of Francis Scott Key's Star-Spangled Banner was Fort McHenry, and of course, that fort was named for this signer of the Constitution. James McHenry was also the founder of the Baltimore Bible Society, which today has changed its name to the Maryland Bible Society. Notice James McHenry's forceful declaration on the importance of the Bible in American society.
Public utility pleads most forcibly for the general distribution of the Holy Scriptures. These can alone secure to society order and peace, and to our courts of justice and constitutions of government, purity, stability, and usefulness. In vain, without the Bible, we increase penal laws and draw entrenchments around our institutions. Bibles are strong entrenchments. Where they abound, men cannot pursue wicked courses.
This signer of the Constitution, James McHenry, believed that the Bible was the best preventative against crime and the best safeguard of civil government. And consider the words of Constitution signers like John Dickinson, who declared,
"Rendering thanks to my Creator for my birth in a country enlightened by the gospel, to Him I resign myself, humbly confiding in His goodness and in His mercy through Jesus Christ for the events of eternity."
And Gunning Bedford declared,
To the triune God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, be ascribed all honor and dominion forevermore. Amen.
And John Jay, the original Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court and an author of the Federalist Papers, declared,
Unto Him who is the author and giver of all good, I render sincere and humble thanks for His manifold and unmerited blessings, and especially for our redemption and salvation by His beloved Son. Blessed be his holy name.
Clearly, these founding fathers and so many, many others were Christians and were not enemies of Christ, despite what current sources may claim.
Do you ever cite in history some kind of a fatal blow to this rewriting of history, or is it just a death by 1,000 cuts, you know?
It's really death by 1,000 cuts. We can show that over the past century, this has slowly been moving away. For example, you take someone like George Washington. This is a guy who was a hero of history for a long time. People who knew him were very favorable toward him. And then as you move to 1926, a book came out called George Washington, The Image and the Man. This book by W.E. Woodward said, you know, we always thought we knew George Washington. That was just the image. Let me tell you about the man. He says, oh, he was immoral. And I have that original 1926 book. It does not have a single footnote in the book, not a single footnote. 1927 book came out and tore that book to shreds. Documentary-wise, said, you said Washington did this here. He wasn't even in that state at the time. He was over. And so it just tore it apart. But what happened was in the 1930s, as people wrote textbooks about Washington, they said, you know, maybe Washington wasn't all he was cracked up to be. And they cite the 1926 book. Then the 1935 books cite the 1930 books, citing the 1926 book. Then the 1940 books cite the 1935 books, citing the 19... And so by the time you get to today, I can show you 100 books today that say that George Washington was immoral, but none of them predate 1926. They all cite back to that one source. And that's what's happened, is we have tons of documentary source, we have tons of eyewitnesses, we have tons of writings, we have 100 volumes of the writings of George Washington. Nope, we're going to look at what this guy said in 1926, and that is the authority. And that's what's happened, is death by 1,000 cuts. What happens today is because we have a viewpoint that the Constitution is secular, and because we as good citizens want to uphold the Constitution, we don't want to be seen as rebels in our own country, we've really come to this kind of a tone and a feeling that if you're pro-faith, pro-religious, you're trying to overturn the Constitution. You're against Americanism. You're anti-American somehow.
Separation of church and state.
Separation of church and state. You're trying to overturn the fundamental underpinnings. No, no, no. Being pro-faith is exactly what produced that document. The guys who produced it were themselves pro-faith. They saw that document as a result of biblical ideas that they incorporated in it. They talk about that in their writings during and afterwards. And for us to be pro-faith, we're right in the tone of what the Constitution is. The secular tone that we get today is exactly opposite to what they intended. But because we don't know our history, we're made to feel like outsiders if we want faith involved in the public arena.
For more information on the American Heritage Series, or to find books and other resources, visit wallbuilders.com. Through the American Heritage Series, renowned historian David Barton communicates our nation's forgotten, godly foundations and encourages us to once again view history through a truthful lens. For only when we recognize and embrace God's hand in our history can America become all that it was intended to be. Through Wall Builders, historian David Barton seeks to rebuild the walls of America's unique religious, moral, and constitutional heritage by educating the public and encouraging people of faith to become active in strengthening America's great foundations. For more information on how you can become involved, visit wallbuilders.com.